US trade deficit. It is a macroeconomic large imbalance.
President Trump has often described the tariff as the most beautiful word in the dictionary.
Medieval recipe for putting money in public coffers is still to the tune of the globalized economy of the 21st century.
What's the way out?
Whether or not we can think of a WTO working without the US as an active member. I think this is perfectly possible.
Thank you, Mr. Lamy, for joining us today. To begin with, could you share your key observations from the first 2 months of President Trump's second term?
If we look back at these last 2 months, I would say that what we've learned is that the US policy has become extremely unpredictable, although it's based on a platform, on a narrative on which Mr. Trump was elected, and which, at least in my view, is based on an overall wrong assumption, which is that the US is a weak country. His very campaign slogan, MAGA, is a strong affirmation that America is not great as it used to be, and that it needs to become great again. This, in my view, is the root of all the problems he's creating. The US economy is not weak. US trade deficit is not a problem, and tariff wall around the US is not a solution to the problems the US have. The US has a strong economy, a relatively high rate of growth, very near full employment, a very efficient, although brutal, version of global capitalism. Now, the US trade deficit is large, has always been large, and will remain large as long as the US consume much more than what they produce. US trade deficit is not a trade issue, it is a macroeconomic large imbalance, which, by the way, they can live with without any problem, given that they have the dollar, which is a world currency, and which is the easiest way to finance this big trade deficit. A normal country would have a problem with a trade deficit that large for such a long time, because a normal country will not be able to finance the deficit. The US don't have this problem. And on tariffs, the belief by Mr. Trump, tariff is a sort of a Swiss knife or silver bullet to address US problems, is dead wrong. What raising tariffs will do, and we have the first sign of that, is increase domestic prices, push up inflation, and slow the economy. It's a worrying picture, of course, because actions based on a wrong analytics of the situation cannot go in the right direction. And what he's doing for the moment is damaging the US economy, which he says he wants to make better, and by consequence, damaging the world economy, given the importance of the US economy in the world economy.
President Trump has often described the tariff as the most beautiful word in the dictionary and views them as a viable source of revenue for the federal government. Does that make sense to you?
There is a sort of intrinsic contradiction that the reason why you raise tariffs is because you want to slow imports, and if you slow imports, you will reduce the amount of duties which tariff gave to the economy. So just this way of thinking is profoundly incoherent. You cannot, on the one side, say it will create a lot of revenues, and on the other side, it will reduce the level of imports. This is incoherent. It does not make sense. As you rightly said, Trump is a big believer that a tariff, which is a sort of medieval recipe for putting money in public coffers, is still to the tune of the globalized economy of the 21st century. This is absolutely wrong.
But the fact is that starting April the 2nd, President Trump has suggested that reciprocal tariffs will be implemented, though potentially less severe than initially expected. How do you think this will affect the global trade landscape?
Is this a major problem for world trade as a whole? No. The US is 15% of the world imports. The remaining 85% of world imports still believe they should abide to the international rules-based trading system as encompassed in the World Trade Organization. So this is a bilateral problem between the US and a number of its trading relationships. If the rest of the 85% of world trade keep calm, cool-headed between themselves, whatever measures they will take to or not retaliate against unconventional, unjustified WTO non-compliant US measures, it should not, as a whole, contaminate the world trading system, provided, of course, which is my assumption, and that's what I hear from EU or China or Brazil or South Africa or Indonesia or Vietnam, that they agree to remain bound by the commitments they have taken, even if the US are de facto stepping out of a rules-based international trade order and, to be frank, of the World Trade Organization.
And countries have already responded to President Trump's tariff policies with retaliatory measures. So do you think such retaliation is effective, both economically and politically? And what might happen if tensions escalate further?
Most countries, including the European Union, are pursuing a double track. One, ready to negotiate. There is room for a balanced negotiation. Then, if there is no room for that, or no willingness from the US to enter in such a balanced negotiation, and if the US impose WTO non-compliant trade measures, then countries are entitled to retaliate. This is a very well-known, traditional way to react, and in my view, this will happen and increase the negative impact of tariff increases by the US, hence probably sooner or later create in the US domestic economy evolutions that will either push Wall Street or Main Street to push back on these damaging trade and tariff policies by the US.
And in response to the uncertainties of President Trump's tariff policies, many countries have opted for bilateral negotiations with the US and less of collective action. In other words, what are the implications of a potentially weakened WTO in this context?
And I've said that publicly many times, is that the US, since roughly 2008, have progressively, step by step, exited the WTO. This is a long-term issue the US from Obama on have been holding the view that WTO disciplines were unfairly constraining the US, whereas they were not fairly constraining other economies such as China. Now, is this view unfounded? Yes and no. Yes, it is unfounded that, for instance, the view that China cheated at the WTO in not respecting WTO disciplines is wrong. But yes, it is founded because in a number of trade-related, trade-impacting measures, the WTO net of disciplines is weak, such as, for instance, in the area of subsidies, where WTO disciplines are very soft. And the reason for that is that WTO members, US, China, Japan, Europe, and a few others, never agreed to strengthen the strictures of the WTO net of discipline on subsidies. This is an issue which is open. So overall, I think the main medium and long-term trajectory is the US stepping out of international disciplines that they believe unfairly constrain their sovereignty. It is the same for climate. It is the same for the International Criminal Court. It is the same with the World Health Organization. And this is a huge problem for the rest of the world because it creates a situation where the rule of force becomes more important than the rule of law. And this, in my view, is a major threat to stability and, unfortunately, maybe even to peace.
For my final question, was the US continuously obstructing WTO reforms and the organization's influence diminishing? I hate to ask this, but what do you think of WTO's existence in 10 years or 20 years? Or what's the way out?
The question about the WTO is whether or not we can think of a WTO working without the US as an active member. I think this is perfectly possible. And by the way, when they de facto existed the dispute settlement system, this was replaced by another system to which EU and China belong, which allows trade disputes to be adjudicated in the same way as they were before the US left the dispute settlement system. So this is the proof that a system of disciplines and of adjudication of disputes can work without the US. I think it's perfectly possible, although I believe that short term, what will limit the US capacity to harm the international trading system will come from the US themselves. It's the damage to the US economy which should constrain Trump's policy. If that was not to be the case, and I think we don't know if and when it will be the case, then we will probably need a more explicit, structured coalition of other countries in this planet who want to stick to an international system which is based on the rule of law in order to limit the consequences of the US stepping out of the system. I think this is something we really need to start thinking, and I'm convinced that quite a lot of countries on this planet, starting with developing countries or emerging countries who still need, for instance, a lot of open trade to grow their economies, would be ready to join. I'm not going to say that this can be done overnight, but I think it's something which we need to have in mind for the future if the US were not constrained by their own public opinion, by their own financial markets, by their own population to limit the damage which Trump is inflicting to his own country.
And that demands a whole lot of political wisdom from all over the world. Thank you, Mr. Lamy, for sharing your insights today.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you for these few minutes.